So my name's Liz. I'm going to teach you a thing about language today, not computer languages. This is about English language. Hands up if you're not English. English second language? Okay. Hands up if you speak French as your native language. Any French speakers? Any Dutch speakers? A couple of Dutch speakers, so the Dutch speakers are lucky. When I originally did this talk, I actually did it for DDD Europe, which happened in Belgium. So I've not just got English in this talk. This is about Western languages in general. I don't know whether it's true of Eastern languages at all, but it is true of Western languages. When I first did this talk, I got a little bit of feedback afterwards that some people didn't really get it. So I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes just explaining why this talk is important to me and why I really wanted to do it. Language is how we make sense of the world, right? Language is how we create models in our heads. And when we're using the wrong kind of language, then we make the wrong kind of models and we treat the world the wrong way. I'm going to show you in this talk why the language you use for your work, your software development, is usually wrong. And bear with me, because you're not going to get it at first, but by the end you will. Okay? I will show you how to change the language you use for work, and I'll show you why it's really important as well. Okay. So first of all, let's look at some work. I'm going to give you a really, really quick language change here. Hands up if you're on an Agile project or a Kanban project. You can see this is a Kanban board, right? Because it's got the cues in it. But whether you're on an Agile project or a Kanban project, this is pretty typically what we see. Cards on a wall somewhere, it might be an electronic wall, and the cards represent the work we're doing. So the first thing I always do is I change the word at this end, which often says done. Hands up if you've got a column on your boards that says done, right? That's the first change I would love you to make to your language. You're not done. You might be done, but the work isn't done. Some other poor soul has to go and maintain that. It might be a future version of you, if you're unlucky. You're not actually done until it's not being used anymore, all right? So really, really simple word change. The rest of them are not going to be that easy. The rest of the metaphors I'm going to talk about and the language we talk about is based on this book. It's called Metaphors We Live By. It's written by a couple of cyberneticists who are trying to teach AI how to actually speak and how to use language themselves. And what they found was that all of the metaphors we use in our language are physical. They're actually related to physical things. You can think about that if you know happy, and we talk about being upbeat when we're happy, right? So up is usually good and down is usually bad. One of the things that we frequently do is we use the part for the whole. So we'll take a part and we'll pretend that that part is the whole of the thing. And we do this with the cards, right? So those of you who do software in London, you've probably come across this, a placeholder for a conversation. Hands up if you've seen this before, right? This is a very London-based thing. We talk about those cards on the board as being placeholders for a conversation. Literally, that represents the entire thing, and you've got to remember to have a conversation with it. But we also just use it quite a lot to represent the work, and we'll talk about it like it's a physical thing. The tester picks it up, right? It's like it's a physical thing. Bear with me. There are French translations, the same in French. It's the same in Belgian, in Dutch. Okay? They hand it back to the devs. So the tester picks it up and hands it back to the devs, like it's a ball. I mean, it's where the word scrum comes from, right? It's this idea that as a team we are picking up a ball and progressing this ball, like it's really a physical thing. And it's in the language we use. Return it to the devs, same thing in Dutch. Okay. We treat the activity like it's a substance as well. So the language we have around activity treats it like it's a physical thing. This is one of my favorites. I couldn't do much testing until the end of the sprint, right? Like it's cheese. I wanted 100 grams of testing. I couldn't get 100 grams. I could only get 50 grams of testing before the end of the sprint. We use the same thing for the activity as we do for things like food, like it's physical. I couldn't do tellement plus de test. I really love this word because you literally, when you say you're full in French, you say, I couldn't eat any more cheese. You say, tellement plus de fromage, couldn't possibly eat any more cheese. Right? It's actually the same phrase that you use when you can't manage any more food. And it's the same thing in Dutch. Our code quality needs to improve, as if it's something that just grows on trees, a physical thing that has qualities and you can go and get it off a tree. Which I found fascinating because what we're really talking about there is actually our coding quality. It doesn't grow on trees. We write the code. So we're using the part for a whole, and we've reduced code, the activity of coding, to a thing, which we're pretending is something physical, when it's actually an abstract action. And work isn't physical. Work isn't made up of nice little things that you can actually pick up and pass around like this. It's fuzzy. It has to do with people and relationships. And the more we use this language, the more we're thinking about it as something that we've got it now, and then we can pass it on to somebody else and we're done with that. Right? But worse, this is the really, really convincing one. This is the one that made me want to do this talk. We treat work as a container. I put a lot of time into that, like it's a container, and you get a lot of fun out of the container, right? In and out of the container. Same thing in French, same thing in Dutch. Those of us on agile projects, we reinforce this even more. We talk about sprint. It's a time box, right? This is a stretch goal. We use words like stretch goal, like it's a physical thing. We might not fit it into the sprint. So we're reinforcing those boundaries. In French, they use this étape bonus, meaning an extra step. So they're literally imagining that there is a boundary and you step beyond the boundary. So again, these physical metaphors. That's out of scope for release 1. We talk about scope like it's a boundary. Like work can be neatly partitioned and we've got this surrounding around it. Same thing in French and Dutch. We need to close all the open tickets, literally like it's a box. There's some stuff in the box and you close it and you open it again. So what we're doing here, we're treating the work as if you can have a bunch of boxes and you'll neatly stack them up. And when you want to do some work, you pick up a box and you take your box and pass it to a tester, like the work fits neatly into that box. I'm going to show you why the work does not fit neatly into boxes and why this analogy is flawed. I found the Dutch for this was really interesting. They use this word afsluiten. Am I pronouncing it anywhere close to the real thing? Afsluiten. Which literally means to cut off, like it's the flow of water. So you're cutting off the water supply. Like you've had enough of that substance that's your open ticket. Now it's all cut off. No more open ticket for you. Right? Very odd metaphors we use. This was one of my favorites. How many stories are in that feature? So it's not just a box. It's a box with other boxes in, because the stories have tasks. Right? You can imagine that there's a sprint, and the sprint has stories in it, and the stories have tasks in it. There's boxes inside the boxes. And we unpack all the boxes, and then we do the tasks, and then they neatly add up to the stories, except they don't. And the stories neatly add up to the sprint, except it doesn't. I'll show you why that is. In Dutch, they say zitten in the feature, literally sitting in the feature. And you can imagine all these little boxes happily sitting away inside a bigger box. Right. Does anybody remember this game? Asteroids? Right. So some people are old enough to remember it. What happens in the Asteroids game when you shoot the really big asteroids? They come into smaller ones, medium-sized ones. How do the medium-sized ones move with respect to the really big ones? They move faster, right. And when you shoot the medium-sized ones, they become tiny ones, right? And how do the tiny ones move? They're faster still. They're really fast. So when you start playing this game, a really good way to die is to shoot all the big asteroids and then all the medium asteroids until you've got tiny, tiny little asteroids floating around. Because you won't be able to keep track of them. They'll come out of nowhere and surprise you, and you'll die pretty quickly if you do that. If you do this with your work, you will kill your project. Okay? This is a really good way to kill projects, is to break absolutely everything down into tasks before you start. It does actually work a lot better if you take the big asteroids and you break them down, and then you pick off the small bits, and then take another big asteroid. We use terms like epics and so forth to help us do that planning. But we still think of it as if it's a container. Right? This is a way that I normally create my boxes. And I tell people, don't break it all down at the beginning of a project, but I still think of it this way, or I used to. I think of it in terms of, you've got a vision, a thing that you want to achieve, and you've got some stakeholders who have some goals that they want to achieve, and inside the goals, they're made up of capabilities, and the capabilities have scenarios which you implement using features, and the features have stories in them, and the stories have code, and then you're done. And it all neatly piles up into that vision. Except it doesn't. It never actually works, because this isn't what a project looks like. Here's what a real project looks like. Oh, we forgot a bit. And we didn't know about that bit, and it turns out that these guys are all connected, and we didn't need that bit there. Can't remember what that's for. Right, this is what a real project looks like. My long-term friend and mentor, Dan North, who's the guy who came up with BDD, he calls these oh crap moments. Right? They're discoveries. This is what a project is really made up of. The Agile Manifesto says we're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. But I don't believe that's what actually makes Agile different. We were doing that back in the days of Waterfall. I spent 7 years mostly doing waterfall projects, and we were always trying to find better ways of doing software. But what Agile does do is it teaches us how to discover stuff and how to react to those discoveries. And this is why putting all the work into the boxes doesn't work. Because it's not neat, because there's stuff that happens at the edges, because there's stuff around those boundaries, and we discover it late, and it doesn't fit neatly into boxes, and the boxes never add up to a bigger thing. So I want to show you why this is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the innovation cycle. So do any of you remember the very first early days of the camera phones? Hands up if you thinking Nokia? Yeah? Nokia actually were some of the latecomers to the game. There were people like Sharp and Kyocera were the first people to really put cameras on phones. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for the camera phone, you'll see there's a photo of one of Kyocera's on there, and it's actually horizontal. It's landscape, and the camera's pointed towards the user because they thought that people would use it for making video calls. And it turned out the thing they discovered was that the internet didn't really support that, and that actually people mostly wanted to take pictures, mostly of themselves. So Nokia put the camera on the back and with a little mirror. Do you remember? You used to have a little mirror on, right? So that was a differentiator back then, having a camera on your phone. And what Nokia did was they spoiled that differentiator. They said, we can see how that's going to work better. We're going to have that too. What else does a camera phone need to do other than cameras? Make calls, right? It's a phone. It's also a phone. It needs to make calls, receive calls. Where do you think the discoveries are going to be made? Do you think they're going to be made on the making calls and receiving calls that we're used to doing anyway? They're more likely to be made on the camera side when you start doing cameras, right? Whenever you do these new things that you haven't done before, you make discoveries. And you're always, always doing something new. Whenever you have a project or something you want to produce, some product, it's because you want to give something or someone a new capability. Either letting them do something they couldn't do before, a person, so an employee, your customer, or some system maybe. You're letting them do something they couldn't do before. Or you're letting them do something in a new context. They couldn't do it within that context, so you're giving them a new context they can have. And whenever you do these new things, you make the discoveries. The commoditized stuff like making a call, receiving a call, it's not very high discovery. You might still need to do it. David Anderson calls them the table stakes, the things you need just to play the game. Right? It's pretty boring. But you're doing it because you want that new stuff out, and that new stuff always has discoveries. Of course, as you begin to understand how the discoveries work, and you make the discoveries, like, okay, they want the phone on the back, now you're beginning to move from that differentiating place where you were making lots of discoveries, and it's becoming commoditized. So hands up if you've got a camera on your phone. Keep your hands up if you've got two, one on the front and one on the back. Right. Okay? It's become commoditized. And this is what happens. We start understanding our work better, and as we understand it, then it becomes predictable. And then we can put it into boxes, and the parts do come neatly together. But it doesn't start out that way. And we can build on the commoditized stuff. We can build on the fact that we've now got cameras on the phones. And we can do interesting things with it, like overlay things on a street view and point your camera at something and have it immediately translate text for you. Stuff like that. So I want to show you Cynefin. I've just shown you the innovation cycle, and I do that first because the dynamics in this framework are as important as the actual bits of the framework itself. So I wanted to show you that there is this loop, and you can see it, I've been overlaying it on this nice little grey diagram. Cynefin is a framework for making sense of different situations and how you approach them depending on how much predictability they've got in them. And I think it's pretty much my favourite thing of the last 5 years. It's really easy to understand, and it's totally changed the way I live my life. So this has been life-changing for me. And I'm hoping, hands up if you've never come across Cynefin before. Oh, fantastic. You guys are going to love this so much. You really are. Okay, the hardest thing about Cynefin is pronouncing it. It's a Welsh word. So I would like you all to say the name Kevin, like Kevin Costner. Can you all say Kevin? Kevin, right? You put an "un" in that and you say Cynefin. Fantastic. Now you all know how to pronounce it. It was created by a guy called Dave Snowden. He wrote an HBR article, Harvard Business Review article, called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making, where he introduced it. Along with, I think, Mary Boone, her name was. When you read that, the first domain that he introduces, it used to be called simple. They've renamed it to the obvious domain. And these are domains, not quadrants. There are actually 5 of them. And as we've seen, the borders are fuzzy and things move around in it. But the obvious problems are ones which either a child can solve, or if they do require expertise, the solution's obvious. So I go to my landlady and I say, what do you do when the beer in the pub runs out? And she says, well, I change the barrels, obviously. Right? So that's how you know something's obvious. It's obviously. And when something is that obvious, we can categorize the problem. We can say, oh, it's one of those problems. Okay, that's pretty simple to solve. But as things become more and more complicated, there are more and more parts to them. It's still predictable, but it requires expertise to understand it. So a watchmaker can take a watch apart and put it back together again, and a car mechanic can fix your car. And you can analyse those problems. You can go, okay, if I do this thing with the expertise that I have, then here will be the result, and that will be what I want. And that's absolutely fantastic. We can analyse that. We can break that into boxes and break down the problem, and it will all be good. But there is a domain in which cause and effect are only correlated in retrospect. It's a high discovery domain, and the outcomes of this domain emerge. So I'm going to give you an example. There was once a company called Ludicore. They had this big online multiplayer game, big fantasy game called Neverending, and they wanted to get more people to come and play the game. So they said, well, what we'll do, we'll set up a site where people can share screenshots of the game. And they'll enjoy playing it, so they'll come along and they'll take the screenshots, and everyone will see how engaged the players are, and everyone will see how pretty the game is, and then we'll get more players, and more players will come along. And so they set up this site, and people started sharing screenshots of the game, and holiday photos, and photos of their family, and kittens, and all the other things you find on the internet. And that became Flickr. And in retrospect, you go, oh, okay, I can see how that happened, but you couldn't possibly have predicted it. And this is what happens when you do new things. You make these discoveries, the outcome emerges, and in retrospect, you can see it. And those of you who are on Agile projects, you're probably used to this. You show things to your business, to your customers that they've not seen before, and they go, oh, okay, that's not what I meant, or it's not what I wanted. Can we change this, do this? And the outcome emerges over time. This is why Agile's been so successful, because it allows for that feedback loop. It allows for that emergence to happen. So what we have to do in complexity is probe. We have to try something out, and it has to be safe to fail, because it will. Some of the time, you will do something and it won't be the right thing, and the right thing will emerge over time. The reason this is important is because of this fourth domain, which is chaos. Chaos is accident and emergency, and your house burning down. Chaos is a transient domain. It resolves itself quickly, and it might not resolve itself in your favor. So in chaos, what we have to do is we act. And we have to act fast. The other reason that's important is because of the fifth domain in the middle, which is disorder. And disorder is the domain where we don't know which of these dominates, and so we behave according to our preferred domain. And most humans like predictability. Most of us feel fairly uncomfortable with uncertainty. And when we can't get rid of uncertainty, we pretend we can get rid of it. And we try and break problems down, and we think that that will give us the right answer. So I'm going to give you an example. Hands up if you've ever given an estimate for something you've never done before. Keep your hands up if it then got turned into a promise. Right, okay? That's an example of disorder. You gave an estimate, you'd never done it before, you didn't really know how long it was going to take, and then somebody pretends that that's actually predictable, and that can then be used to make commitments to other people with. And it's not, because you make discoveries if you've never done it before, and while you might have a guess, that's all it really is, it's a guess. There's a lovely law called Hofstadter's law, which says everything will take longer than you estimate it will, even when taking into account Hofstadter's law. Right? It doesn't matter, you will take longer. So when we're in disorder and in disorder for some time, we end up tipping into chaos fairly frequently. So, you've made this commitment based on some guesses that you took on this new work that you've never done before, or never done within the context of that organisation. And you're making discoveries on it, but now you're making them very late. And now you're working weekends and overtime trying to meet that deadline, which was made because somebody made some commitments to somebody else, not realizing that there were those discoveries inherent. And it gets worse because we really like the idea that some things can be made predictable. So what tends to happen is, if there's a really tricky problem, a really tricky bit of stuff that's proving hard to analyze, we tend to leave it till later. Yeah, don't worry, but we're on it. It's just taking some time. And it gets later and later until right at the end of the project, you get to the actual reason that you were doing the project in the first place. And then it's too late to properly analyze it. So you try something out, but now it's not safe to fail anymore. And hence, we end up working too late. So what you do instead is actually embrace that uncertainty, okay? Whenever you find something new and it's resisting analysis, hands up the devs in this room. I'm going to make you put your hands up a lot today, right? So devs, you have the power here. You can say, well, look, we've never done this before. How about we do a spike? How about we do a prototype? How about we give you something that we can then iterate on, and we can look at, and we can actually have some idea of what we're doing and slowly move into that complicated space again. And you can embrace that really early on in a project. Find out what it is on your project that your project is designed to give that's new, and focus on it. I've had projects where the only reason we were doing that project was because the maintenance of the previous project had become so high, and it was an incremental rewrite. The only reason why we were doing it was that maintenance. And the first thing that's happened was we got put under pressure, and so we ended up cutting some corners, and so the technical debt went up, and bingo, we were back where we started again. All right? And that's because we weren't paying attention to the thing we were getting that was new, which was the maintainability. If we had been, we'd have been able to put some stuff around that to ensure that it stayed in place. And we would have been able to have conversations. Remember, the reason we're doing this is because the old system wasn't maintainable. It's going to take time to do it properly. Stop putting us under pressure. Yes, we know it's loss-leading. Yes, we know it's costing you a lot of money. Okay? But you can have much more adult conversations when you actually recognize the new thing you're doing that you've never done before. Focus on it, embrace it, appreciate that you're always going to have uncertainty. Just to finish off the Cynefin diagram, there's this little cliff edge down here. That is because along that border between the obvious and chaos is complacency. If you become complacent about the obvious, it's very easy to tip into chaos, and it's very hard to get back the other way. You normally have to throw some constraints around the problem really quickly. Then you're in a place where you can try out some stuff. Then you've stabilized it, and you have to move all the way around again. So here are some numbers that I frequently use when I'm having conversations around Cynefin and complexity. I just ask, who's done this before? Who in the world's ever done this? So 5, nobody in the world's ever done it before. 4, somebody in the organisation's done it, but not here. Right? Somebody outside the organisation's done it. So you know it can be done, but you don't know what they discovered. And both of those are high discovery. The 5 is about as complex as you can get, and the 4s are going to be relatively complex. Every single project has a 5 or a 4 in it. Every single one. A 3, somebody in the company has done it before, so you have expertise available, or maybe you can go look it up on YouTube or read a book and get hold of that expertise. You might have to schedule that expert, and remember that you probably want feedback from them as well, because you're human and you will misunderstand. Human beings are very complex. 2, someone in the team's done it before, and 1, we all know how to do it. Right? So 2s and 1s are commoditized stuff, really boring. Please don't do it yourself if you don't have to. Get something off the shelf, get some open source. If you do find yourself rewriting yet another 2 and a 1, make it a reusable library so you don't have to do it again. Right? And 3s will gradually become 2s and 1s. That's how they fall on the Cynefin diagram. So now you know, you'll be able to look at your projects and tell what's going to be high discovery, what's going to be really boring and tedious, what's perfectly suitable for analysis and great for expertise. Hands up if you're into BDD. Oh, good. That makes me happy. I'm very into BDD. 3s are perfectly great territory for BDD. If you try and do BDD with 5s and 4s, you will often find that the answer to, can you give me an example, is, not sure, maybe not. All right? If you do that, that's great. You've just found uncertainty. So for the scenarios that are hard to find, try something out. Prototype it. Don't pin down something that's in flux. Don't automate scenarios over stuff that's in flux. Right? Wait until it's stabilized a bit. Wait until that 5 and 4 is now understood, and then write the scenarios in retrospect. If necessary, rewrite your prototype and do it with BDD properly. But try something out first. 2s and 1s, you're unlikely to get them wrong. Llewellyn, you've got a question?
Can you give me just a little definition around done it before?
Done it before, log in.
A lot of times, though, people will say, like, oh, yeah, we've done something like this before.
You've done something like this before?
When they do it, it turns out that the thing they did before is nothing like what we're doing.
Well, so I always say, if you're not using a library, if you reckon it's a 2 and a 1, and you're not using a library, make it a library and write some tests around it, because you're doing something for the first time, which is making it reusable. right? So you probably want to write some scenarios about it. The trick is to not leave those 2s and 1s hanging around in your build for ages. Make them into something else that's outside of your build, so you keep your build times down. They're not going to change, right? Once you've written logging in, it's not going to change. If it does change, you'll test it again manually, right? There's no way that you wouldn't check that something works, and these don't change very often. You can just put it in a library and reuse the library. So, yeah, if you've never done it before, or you've not done it within this context, or it's similar to what you've done before, err on the side of caution, always, but be pragmatic about it. We used to teach logging in with BDD. We used to teach, log in as an example to demonstrate BDD, and it was the worst thing we could have possibly done, because now everybody starts with logging in. When they do a new project, frequently the first card says logging in, and everybody gets really hung up on it, whereas actually, what are you logging in for? What is it you're giving to people that they will want to log in for? Do you actually need to log in? You might not need to. I've seen applications which literally just grab your email address. That's it. Bing. Now you're essentially logged in. And when you come back again, it says, well, do you want to log in? And you put in your email address, it says, okay, you haven't got a password yet, I've just emailed you one. Congratulations, now you've got a login. Right? So there's different ways of doing this, but mostly login is boring. Mostly it's boring. Unless you're doing something new with it, don't spend your time analysing that. Spend your time working out what isn't boring and focus on that first. Okay, this is my favourite little book on risk and projects. It's called Waltzing with Bears. And chapter 1, it has this right at the front. If a project has no risks, don't do it. Right? And that is because you're not actually giving anything new to anyone. And always, always, you want to be doing something new. And when there's something new, you're going to make discoveries. I think I've laboured that point long enough. Okay. So let's give you some examples. Self-driving cars is obviously something which it's now becoming understood, but getting them road legal turns out to still be a complex problem. Manned Mars mission, they're trying that out somewhere where it's a bit safer to fail than Mars. Antarctica, they can actually ship people off and get them resources more easily than they can on Mars. Apple's fan base, back in the days of the iPod, you remember the white headphones? It was actually not that fantastic a product, technically. I believe the Zune actually had much better technical specifications, and there were other things with better interfaces. But it had this fan base, and everybody had those white headphones. I used to think it was like aliens taking over the world. You kind of see these people, all these people started having white headphones every day, more and more of them. I found that astonishing. So yeah, Apple's fan base is a differentiator for Apple. Mending watches, we talked about. SAP, it's boring. Don't implement your own CRMs, for instance, unless you're actually a company that sells CRMs. GPS used to be something quite complex, used to be differentiating, now we've all got it on our phones. User registration, it's a CRUD form. We know what CRUD forms look like. Dates, right? You can use a date library, don't work it out yourself, unless you're in the energy business, in which case it turns out that having some days with 25 hours and some days with 23 hours, and you might be billing across different countries with different daylight savings times, actually becomes quite complex or complicated. And so they have specialists and libraries that they use and experts who know how to actually manage the date. Anything which makes you go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, is chaos. And we can all tell stories about chaos. My absolute favourite one of these was a company called Knight Capital Trading Company. They released something into production on 8 of their 9 servers and forgot to put it on the 9th. When they went live the next day, that 9th server started putting spurious trades in the marketplace. 45 minutes later, they had lost enough money that that company no longer exists. 45 minutes to kill a fairly large trading organisation. I thought that was impressive. Okay, So I'm going to show you something I don't often talk about when I teach Cynefin, which is the relationships between the bits of the system. So we talked about boxes, we talked about the parts. I'm going to show you again why this doesn't work. In the obvious domain, it's all about the hierarchy. It's all about something controlling and moving things around. So you can imagine in a supermarket, it's Christmas, you've got students in to come and help out the supermarket. You go, right, you go stack the shelves, you go get the trolleys in, you're on checkouts, right? And those three individuals do not need to relate to each other at all to get their jobs done. In the complicated system, the relationships are also important. So when you've got cogs that are working together in a watch, they need to work together, as well as have somebody put that together. But in a complex system, it works best when everything's about those relationships between the agents. This is what we call self-organizing teams, right? The agents in a human system, a software system, are humans. And so we have these self-organizing teams. And it works best when there's somebody whose job is not to direct the people on the team, but simply to make sure they have an environment in which their work can get done, and to make sure that the vision of that work is really clear. And then, because the people on the ground have the knowledge, the skills, the relationships to actually get the work done, it works really, really well. In the chaotic environment, people are not related at all. And you can tell this because when you're in an airplane and they tell you about the masks, they say, always put your own on before you help somebody else, right? You act as individuals, you act to preserve yourself first, and then worry about other people once it's safe. Okay. So the obvious domain is the domain of the known knowns. Things which are certain, things which are provable. The complicated domain is the known unknowns. There is an expert somewhere. We might not have that expertise, but we know if expertise is required. The complex domain is the unknown unknowns. So thank you, Donald. That's pretty good. The chaotic domain is the unknowable unknowns. You can't even start to understand until you're out of chaos. So if you're focusing on anything, this is urgent production bugs, expedited issues, right? That first. And then wherever the high discoveries are, wherever the things that are going to trip you up. You won't know what's going to trip you up. Are there any managers here, any project managers, Scrum Masters? Right, it's a few of you. So you might have come across risk logs. One of the things that waterfall project people like doing is that they'll write a risk log. They're only writing down the things they know are going to be problems, not the unknown unknowns. You can't know what those are, but you do know now where they're going to be. They're going to be in the new stuff. Okay? So why do we probe before we sense? All of these come with this sense, do something, respond, or, in the case of chaos, act, then sense, then respond. But why would you want to not even sense too much? Why would you not want to do some analysis before you try something out? Well, it's because of the way our brains work. Our brains are biased. There's a term called epiphany, which you're probably all familiar with. It's that sense of revelation when you get something. You look at it and go, oh, okay, I get it. The term epiphany was originally coined by a German psychologist for that sense of epiphany that schizophrenics get. When they go, oh, I get it, but they really don't. They're wrong. It's actually come into the English language as the way people see patterns which aren't there. And we all do it. We all see patterns which aren't there. I'm going to give you a very famous example. This is a photo that was taken of Mars by the Viking 1 orbiter. So it goes over Mars, and it took this photo. And I don't know if you can see that hill up there. It's a face, right? Zoomed up, so it's a face. And back in 1976, everybody's like, oh my God, it's a face on Mars. There are Martians. Martians are real, right? And got really fixated on this idea that Martians were a thing. This is actually pareidolia. It's a subset of epifania. It's our tendency to see faces in things. And when the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter with slightly better cameras went over and took the photo, this is what it actually looks like. And you can see it was just the lighting. It was just the blurred photography. It wasn't actually a face. It doesn't look anything like a face. When I first showed this to somebody at the DDD Europe, they said, the Martians knew we were coming and scrubbed it off. Right? And I find that really interesting because when we see a pattern, we get fixated on it. We think, well, that must work. That must be the thing. That must be right. We've seen the pattern. And there's all kinds of psychology experiments they've done with this to show people will fixate on patterns that don't exist. Particularly, we like to try and do root cause analysis. And it doesn't work in a complex space. We try and find things that fit the patterns that are already in our heads, and that's confirmation bias. So what we're doing when we break down our project into lots of little boxes is we're creating that bias for ourselves that that's really what the project looks like. And we forget to get feedback. And we forget that we're not done yet. And we forget that there are other people. And we forget that it's fuzzy and full of discoveries. So epifania and pareidolia are two other kinds of bias, but there are more. There's an actor-observer bias, Google effect, which I love. It's our tendency to forget things that we know we can look up later. Illusion of control, insensitivity to sample size. There's a lot of them. When I actually went to look on this, there were 159, I think it is. Yeah, 159 cognitive biases on Wikipedia when I went to look them up. And it changes. They discover more all the time. So in this complicated domain, things are made up of the sum of their parts. But in the complex domain, we know it's made up of the interaction between the agents. And the agents are people. And our language has been dividing our work into little boxes, not the relationships between people. So I'm going to show you how to break the containers and actually change the language you use to talk about work. So let's look at this one. I couldn't do much testing until the end of the sprint, okay? There's a couple of boundaries there. One is the testing as a substance. So we treat it like it's a physical thing and not fuzzy. Who is the person who benefits from the testing? Who's related to the tester from the testing? It's a dev, right? It's actually getting feedback on the dev's work. That's what you're doing. So when you look at the relationships between the people, what you're really saying isn't, I couldn't do much testing. Oh, my mic's just gone. Can you all still hear me? Yeah? Okay, I'll shout. It says I wasn't able to give the devs any feedback until the end of the sprint, but the sprint's a boundary as well. Oh, there we go, we're back. The sprint is also a boundary. So who's on the other side of that boundary? Who's not in the team that you have to have the sprint for? And it's always about feedback. It's generally about feedback. So it's the other stakeholders that you're going to show the work to in the showcase or the show and tell, right? Sprint review. So what you're really saying is, I wasn't able to give the devs any feedback before they showed the work to the stakeholders. And that I find much more powerful than I couldn't do much testing before the end of the sprint. Because now you can actually see what the impact of that is. You can break the boundaries of the containers. Same in French. That's out of scope for release 1. Okay? Again, the scope is a container. We're taking that scope and we're using it like a box. Who's the person who benefits from the scope and that limited scope? It's usually the people you're actually going to get release 1 to, right? There's some customers out there, there's some people out there who want something and they want it fairly quickly. So what we're really saying is something like our main stakeholder wants to satisfy the needs of those people over there first. And that's a much more convincing way of persuading people not to put stuff into release 1 that doesn't need to be there. And you will still use that box metaphor. You won't break these boundaries all the time, but having an awareness that any time something's going wrong, any time the process isn't lending itself to what you're trying to do, think about using that language, the language of feedback, the language of relationships, the language of the people involved in the system, rather than just the language of the work. How many stories are in that feature? What you're really saying is, often, what can I promise to my stakeholders? Or how can we coordinate ourselves to work on this together? It's not always clear. So when somebody says something like, well, how many stories are in that feature? Or how long do you reckon that's going to take? You can ask, well, okay, who's the person you're about to make a commitment to? Who's the person that is going to be involved in this, that you want to have that feedback from, or you want to have a relationship with? Or maybe you're looking to open up some options rather than to make an investment or a commitment. I like options. Options are great when there's uncertainty. Whenever you make a commitment in uncertainty, you better be sure that you're giving yourself a pretty big buffer, because it will take longer than you think, even taking into account Hofstadter's law. So before you go around asking, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? The one thing I do like to do is to ask, who are we doing this for? Or who's the person who knows about this? Identifying the people who are involved can make sure that you're asking the right people that question, why? So here's how I do it. I actually wrap the whole value stream in terms of people. I go, okay, we're a dev team, and somebody came up with this idea that they want us to do. Who's actually between them and us? And these are all the people that I call them educators, people who come up with requirements up front before it even often gets to the dev team. So it might be people who do, we've got a feasibility study here and a PMO board, right? In large organizations, this can be a lot of people before it even gets to the dev team. But then you've got the gatekeepers going out the other side as well. So when you look the other way, you can start seeing maybe there's an architecture group who are going to do a review of your code before they let it go live, or there's some security people or some compliance people. The real trick is, if you find there are people in the gatekeepers that you've never worked with before, you've never delivered this thing before, they shouldn't be on this side. They should be educators. They should be much closer to the team, working before and with the team, right? So either they're doing prototypes of their own, or you can offer them a prototype. Remembering that those people who want something new, the people who are educating you about the stuff that needs to get done, this is a good place to have educators, right? Gatekeepers should be twos and ones. It should be a checkbox. Yes, that works. The threes, twos, the fives, fours, and threes, those educators are the people you want in your meetings, in your showcase, to give you that feedback. You don't need to worry about it too much for the twos and ones. It's an email gateway. If it's broken, you'll know. And you'll know when it's working, right? And you're probably using a library anyway. So value streams are made of people. And when you start seeing your work this way, start seeing your work in terms of the people who are involved in the different phases of it. One of the things I like to do, because I'm a coach, hands up if you're a coach, consultant. There's a few people, right? I ask the person who's got me in, okay, can you draw the boundary of your influence on this? Because your problems will always be across that boundary with the relationships you don't have influence over. And you can actually start focusing on building better relationships. And suddenly the work will be flowing more smoothly because of that. Because it's easier to get feedback, because it's easier when there's an issue to get that resolved. And just remember, whenever you're having trouble with your work, it's not a technology problem. I think it was Dan who said, if you've only got a technology problem, you don't have a problem, right? And Jerry Weinberg says, it's always a people problem. And it always is. Thank you. I've got a couple of minutes. Are there any questions at all? No? Heads all full? Okay. I had a hearing problem a couple of days back, and it's only just resolved. So I didn't sign up for the Meet the Speaker, because it's going to be in a very noisy hall. However, my hearing is feeling better, so I will probably be wandering around the Meet the Speaker area, and if anybody does want to come talk to me afterwards, you're welcome to do so. Cheers.